Music theory with OneNote. Chords named by mode and modal half steps, comparing and contrasting the three major modes, the Ionian, the Lydian, the Mixolydian. So get ready and some coffee, because although we're just playing with one note, it's a beautiful note. You're not required to, but if you have access to it and would like to follow along, we're currently in the OneNote file of the Modal Node System MNS Presentation 1175 Excel, chords named by mode and modal half steps. Presentation list on the right. We plan on adding plenty more to them shortly. Also noting that in this OneNote presentation, we could spend all of our time on the music theory side of things, but we also have multiple similarly numbered and named presentations where we build out these tables in Excel, practicing both our Excel tools and our music theory at the same time. So what we want to do here is think about the construction of the chords, and let's get a quick idea as to why there could be a problem with the current naming conventions. And the general thing I want to be putting in our mind all the time is there an easier way to be doing the current process than has been historically been put together? And I think oftentimes with music theory, the answer is yes, because we have more information at this time. And then the question is, well, if I learn it that way, is the speed that I will do it, because I'm going to be going as the crow flies, worth it, so that I then have to bridge the gap so I can communicate to the current method? And usually it's going to be easier. Why? Because again, you're going to learn it in the most streamlined way possible, as the crow flies, and then you're going to be bridging that to the current system, winding around the mountains and doing everything you have to do, jumping through the hoops that the bureaucrats make you jump through in order to communicate the stuff. So how does that relate here? Let's do our analogy, remembering that our fretboard is going to be our map of the territory. We're going to compare it to the globe. We're going to say that there's 7 continents. Now those continents repeat, but there's only 7 continents on the globe. Now there's 12 actual locations, but the non-continent locations are going to be the oceans. We go through them to land on the continents. We're going to imagine our perspective from space, like our head up here over the fretboard. The fretboard, by the way, having the low or heavy E string, the one closest to the ceiling on top. We then imagine the fretboard spinning around like the globe does. It's rotating to the right, let's say. And we can imagine we assign it 12 different points of rotation, so all the continents are rotating around. Well, then we need to name them 1 through 12. Those are going to be the 12 notes in the musical alphabet. If we say we want to name our vantage point number 4, the C vantage point, then the fretboard would look like this. And once I locate the locations, like this square right here, then that square will always have the same continent names, which are not the note names. They are you could say Nashville number system names, or they're the modes, the Ionian, the Lydian, the Phrygian, the Mixolydian, the Dorian, the Aeolian. So that's the idea. If we shift it up to the right, then you're going to have a C sharp, but the whole thing will be shifted up. And therefore, this will have the same name, which would be the Ionian. So that means that what we want to do is look at the vantage point and then memorize the thing that's completely shiftable, which on the guitar, because it's a symmetrical instrument, is even more shiftable than any other instrument. Well, most other, like the piano. I always compare it to the piano because the piano is the baseline instrument that we built the music theory on. Beautiful instrument, but that did lead to certain things that might be complicating the system a little bit, particularly if we're on a guitar, which is completely symmetrical. So that's the idea. What's the problem then? Well, if we do terminology for distances, it's often a little wonky, meaning if we have intervals, then the intervals are going to force us to rename our system from the vantage point of the scale degrees. We don't want to do that. Typically, what I'd like to do is measure the distance. Similarly, with chord name constructions, the chords are going to be named based off of scale degrees. And they're also going to be named which chord you're going to play based off of those scale degrees. So if you're in the major key, most people learn that the 1, 4, 5 builds major chords. So you play off the 1, you play off the 4, and you play off the 5, and you memorize that there's bar chords basically there. But we'd like to be able to say, hey, look, these are different. They're all in the same diatonic key. So the 1, 4, 5 actually have different shapes related to them. It's the same shape if you just look at a 3-note triad, but it's still a different location on the fretboard. We'd like to identify that. And if you expand beyond the triad, it's a different shape. So that's one problem. The other problem is if we play in some other mode other than the Ionian, say the Aeolian, which is the minor key, then the minor key, they're going to shift the 6 to the 1. They're going to rename the continent in a scale degree system. That becomes a problem because I'd rather say, look, I'm going to play all the minors, which would be a 6, 2, 3. But they're going to want us to change it to a 1, 4, 5 in the minor key. So that means I have to re-memorize my whole continent when I choose a different tonal center. What does that lead to? It leads to people being very good playing in the major key and not being able to memorize the other keys because they haven't taken the effort to basically re-memorize the number system and know when they can play major and minor chords. But you shouldn't do that. You don't need to do that. You should, if you keep the same numbering system and just use the change to the modal center, then it's going to be easier to do. Also, when we actually construct the chords, if I construct like this D, this is a Dorian chord. If I construct off of this chord, then we would call that a minor triad that we would be making. To build it, we would make this the 1. So we'd make this the 1, and that's not what we want to do because we'd say it's a 1, 3, 5 that would be built off of it. What I'd rather do is say, no, let's keep that as the 2 and then say, look, there's a distance of 2 modal whole steps. That's how we can build it. Alternatively, getting to the same end result, but in a way that we don't have to rename the points on the fretboard. So let's see what that would look like. All right. So we're going to say, let's look at our building blocks. We've got all of our notes. Now I'm going to name the notes this way, give them a number and a letter. The sharps and flats I'm going to call A, B. Those are the ones that are between the A and the B. So these are the 12 notes in the musical alphabet. Those are going to be naming our perspective generally. And then once we know the perspective, I would say that you want to spend most of your time memorizing the continents, the modes, the Nashville number system, if you want to see it that way. And then we have the 7 notes. Now we're going to be using the key of C, which is customary because it has that nice internal control check, which is going to be that there's no sharps and flats in it. Now that's kind of an arbitrary thing. We've talked about that before, but it does work as a nice internal control. So if we apply our formula, we go whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. We get to 7 notes out of the 12 notes. Now, these 7 notes are still, you can imagine them as the continents on the globe, but the continents, you can imagine them kind of like they are on the globe, are like in a circle. Like we only go in a circle. We're not going zigzag to the continents, really. We're going to say that they always go around in a circle for the distance. So you're going around the block, around the continents. You go around the block for all of the notes in the musical alphabet. So how do we build chords then? We take the 7 notes and then we skip every other note from whatever node that we are on. That's the same no matter what chord construction convention that we use. So if I want to build minor chords, we start on the Ionian and we skip every other note. A triad would be the Ionian, the Phrygian, the Mixolydian, right? If I went to the next major mode would be the Lydian, I skip every other note, Lydian, Aeolian, Ionian. Now, most people don't name them by the node names. They name them by the letters. But although that might have functionality on the piano, which is not symmetrical, that might help you know where your fingering is because the black keys aren't going to line up all the same way. It's not helpful on the guitar. It's way more helpful to name the nodes in the system because those are completely movable. Right? We want to do things that are completely movable on the guitar. I think you would want to do that on the piano as well, but I'm not going to make the argument for the piano. Maybe there's something I don't understand on the piano, but on the guitar, clearly we want to make it completely movable. I mean, it's just obvious. That's what you want to do, right? So you want to name it by the nodes typically. All right, so that's going to be the idea. Now we'll get into the idea of major and minor, but we'll talk more about that later once we get into the intervals. So we'll revisit the chords after we talk about intervals. Right now, we just want to intuitively note you can build the chords without even knowing the intervals, really, because you can just start on whatever node you're in and just skip every other note because you know the 7 notes and they're in order like going around the block. Now, the current system doesn't really list it that way, and that's why it's a little bit confusing. So let me show you what I mean. We're going to imagine that we've got the 7 modes, so we're going to name them 1 through 7. That's like the Nashville number system. I'm not going to change the numbering system when the scale degree changes. That's going to be the difference. I want to keep that the same. That, if you were to build the system from scratch today, would be the way, this is just a system, a computer programmer, an engineer, that's what they would do, right? Why? Because it makes sense. It's the most makes sense thing to do, okay? So we want to do the thing that makes most sense. Why? Because it's going to be easier to learn it that way. So then I'm going to give it a letter. Ionian's going to be a small I, Dorian a small d, Phrygian a small p, Lydian a small y, Mixolydian an x, Aeolian an a, Locrian an n. Why do we have the y for Lydian? Because I don't want to make a small l. Why do we have an X for Mixolydian? Because the M's look like major or minor, so I picked an X. Why N for Locrian? Because I don't want a small L because it looks like a 1, and it's crazy, so I can think of the N as it's backwards, right? So the Locrian's backwards, so we take the back letter if you want to memorize it. Now, if it's the tonic, if we're building a chord and it's the tonic, and we use these letters in the chord construction, we can actually show whether the chord is the tonic, meaning the home base, the tonal center, or not, by capitalizing it or not, which you can't really do in the current naming convention. All right, so this is going to be the modes, the Ionian, the Dorian, the Phrygian, the Lydian. We have also a short name for them. I'm just going to give it the 3-letter Ion, Dor, Phryg, Lydian, Mix, Aeolian, Locrian. All right, so then let's start with a 3-note major chord. So if these are our list of notes, we're going to start on the Ionian. Remember that this is true for all 12 notes. There's nothing special about the key of C, right? It's just the one that happened to be historically what we always work with and what they happen to, use what they call the natural notes because it came first and then they jammed in all the sharps and flats. But in theory, there's nothing special about it. So if I shifted my perspective on the guitar to C sharp, to B, to C, to D or whatever, it would all be the same, right? All the 7 notes would be all parallel. They'd all shift up the same. So the chord construction would be the same. We just happen to be on the C here. How do we make a triad? What you do is you take your scale, or I'm just going to say my collection of notes that are in order, and I'm going to start on the node that is the C and just skip every other note. So it would be Ionian, Phrygian, Mixolydian. That's the same no matter what. Now, the naming convention is where it gets a little wonky. So what are we going to call it? A C major or just a C. It's defaulted as the C. So you don't really have to say major, but if you wanted to clarify that it's major versus minor, you can put then C major. That's the way the current system basically works. If you just see a C in the context of a chord, we assume it's major unless it says otherwise. But if you want to be more clear, you can say it's a C major. And sometimes you might use a capital M versus a lowercase m for major or minor. Now, note that the context here, when I say major, that basically kind of makes it like modes don't exist, right? Because a lot of people don't even know that the major is the Ionian mode. So they kind of pulled out the Ionian mode, they threw away the mode name and said, this is the major mode. The king of modes is kind of what seems to be happening here. So, and then they want to build everything else off of the major. So we're going to say that's going to be our baseline, is going to be the C major. Now, I would think it would be better to call it by mode, because once I get to the other modes, like in particular the Dorian and the Mixolydian, the system kind of falls apart, right? And the naming conventions get really wonky, and they don't give you context within the song. So I would think it would be better to call it by mode. So I would think the default would be C, and it would be the Ionian. I would call it an IC2, naming it in a modal construction. Now you might say, hey, look, no one does that. How can I communicate with anyone else? Well, you can still convert it easily enough. Even like if you learn this, you can put it into ChatGTP or something to do the conversion because it's all logical. But I really think if you name the chords you're playing by the mode, that's going to be a lot easier for you to contextually see where you are on the fretboard. And that's the point of like tablature. That's the point of chords, right? What you had is sheet music, which was like multiple instruments playing in an orchestra before, right? They were all playing in an orchestra and they're all playing like melodies, but you put the melodies all together and whatnot. So maybe the chord construction is not quite as important, but if you're playing on a guitar or a piano, chords and tablature becomes more important. We need a way to jot it down. And this is the system they kind of came up with, but it's not the most efficient system. It would be easier to jot down, hey, look, I'm on the 1, the 4, the 5, and to see them differently, to see them as modal chords, because that tells you where you are in the context of both the song and the fretboard. This will become more apparent once we get through the Ionian and we get to like the Lydian and the Mixolydian. All right, if I say IC2, why do I call it a C2? It's an Ionian, it's a C chord, and the 2 means that I'm going to be measuring distance. That's going to be what I call 2 modal whole steps, meaning I don't need to say the scale degree. I want to measure it in distance. So if you're on the Ionian, I'm going to call it a modal whole step, which is you skip one, and then another modal whole step, you skip one. So you're on this node, and then there's 2 modal whole steps. So that's why I'm going to call it an IC2 chord, which is a 3-note Ionian C chord. It's a 3-note Ionian C chord. All right. If it was the tonic, I can capitalize the I. See how that can give me more context within the song and say, hey, look, this is the tonal center of the song, which I'm showing with the fact that I have a capital I instead of a lowercase I. You don't have to use that, but I think that would give you a little bit, see how that gives you more context within the song, which is the whole point of jotting the stuff down. Okay, so then what would this be in terms of the modal half steps? So I would call this distance terms. So this would be similar to the scale degrees. So what I'm going to say is I would rather from like if you were to build the system today, I don't want to rename this as the 1. It happens to be the 1, but I'd rather just call that node. I'm on the Ionian node, and I'm going to say that's 0, and then I'm going to go up 2 modal half steps, which is 1 modal whole step, and another 2 modal half steps, which is 1 modal whole step. So I'm going to have the node we're on plus 2 modal half steps plus 2 modal half steps. Right? If I convert that to the scale degrees, what does that do? From a scale degrees standpoint, the Ionian would be the 1, and then I would go up 2 modal whole half steps and up 2 modal half steps. So from my perspective, from a programming perspective, from just a systems perspective, the scale degree system is off by 1 because they started counting from the node they were on as the 1 instead of counting from the node we're on as you typically measure things. When you measure things, you don't count the thing that you're on, you measure from the thing that you're on. So from a systems perspective, the current thing that we're using is off by 1 because of that error. So it would be better it'd be better to say, look, it's distance-wise 0, 2, 4. And that converts to the scale degrees, which would all be off by 1 of the 1, 3, 5. So in other words, when we look at this chord, we would say they're going to make this the 1 from a scale degree standpoint and say it's the Ionian, the Phrygian, and the Mixolydian. They're going to say C, E, and G, but I would rather say Ionian, Phrygian, Mixolydian because that works in any key, right? And so I'd rather say, well, this is the node we're on, 0 plus 2 plus another 2, 0, 2, 4. Right, instead of 1, right? So if you learn it that way, you'll actually learn what distance means. These are supposed to be distance terms that they turned into scale degree terms, but they should be distance terms. Okay, so that's an easy conversion. Is what I'm trying to say here. So then, what if I notice I can name the chord by nodes? Nobody does this, but they should because especially on the guitar, because if you name the points, you could say it's the 0, 2, 4 or the 1, 3, 5 scale degrees, but if it would be better to name than naming by notes to name by nodes. Instead of telling the notes that are in there, you say the continent names that are in there. right? You have, if you're starting on the Ionian is the 1 in our Nashville music system. So if I start on the 1 and then I go up 2 modal whole steps, I get to the 3, 2 modal whole steps, I get to the 5. So from a Nashville number system, I could still call it a 1, 3, 5, but that just happens to be because the Ionian has the 1. It'll be different once we get to the other modes. So I'm going to say, what are the nodes in it? What continents do I have to hold down with my finger? I have to hold down the Ionian, the Phrygian, the Mixolydian, right? I have to hold down here the Ionian, the Phrygian, and the Mixolydian, right? And it would be a bar chord. You can see it this way, bar chord, and here, right? And that's what you got to hold down. And you might say, well, why don't you say you got to hold down, a C, a G, and an E? Because if you moved this whole thing up to a C sharp, you'd still be holding down an Ionian, Mixolydian, and a Phrygian, a 1, 3, 5 node standpoint. Whereas the notes will be different. Now the 1, 3, 5 happens to line up to the scale degrees. That's only because we're on the Ionian though. It'll be different once we get to the next one. All right. So what if we said we want to build a 4-note chord? What would that be called traditionally? It would be a C major 7. What does that mean? We'll get into these normal naming conventions later and scale degrees later. I just want to list it out for now. C major 7. So now we're listing that it's going to be a major versus a minor, and we have to do that because if we just say C7, it'll be something different. And then we're going to have to say that it's a 7, which lists the scale degree. So meaning if we make the Ionian the 1, it would be the last note, the 7th of it. So it would be a major 7th. So that means that if I'm on the Ionian, from just skipping every other note, we would say, well, we would have an Ionian, a Phrygian, a Mixolydian, and then a Locrian would be the general idea, right? Let me see if I can use the pens up here. We have an Ionian, a Lydian, wait, no, hold on. No, I'm not used to using these pens. Let me do this again. A Mixolydian, and then a Locrian. So that would be the 1, that would be the 3, and then the 5, and then the 7. The 7 is the last one in a scale degree type of system. Now, I think it would be easier to say, it'd be more simple to say, hey, look, we're just doing a C3 chord or an Ionian, an IC3 chord. But you said it was a 4-note chord. It is a 4-note chord because the 3 represents distance from the node we are on, which happens to be the 1 right now because 1 is the Ionian mode, but I don't need to change it if it wasn't the Ionian mode. So I don't need to list the scale degree. I just need to say, hey, look, you just take every other note from that nodal point, right? It's the same thing. So instead of listing it by the scale degree, we just list how many modal whole steps, distance terms, you need to take from the node that you're on. You're just going around the block. That's an easier way to visualize it, and it's easier to figure out on the fretboard because you can figure it out by skipping every other note. Remember, to build these on the fretboard, we usually see them by either shape, and then we can also build them by taking every other note within the scale here, kind of like by formula. And then we can also build them by intervals, which we'll talk more about later. Right now, we're doing the most intuitive way, which is just taking every other note as we go around the block of the 7 nodes. Now, if it was the modal center, we can call it an IC3 and make it a capital. All right, so what would be the modal half steps? So if we start on that node, I'm not going to call it the 1. Because it happens to be node 1 as the Ionian. But if it wasn't node 1, I'm still just going to call it, that's the node we're on. I'm measuring from that point. It is starting at 0, not 1. That's what a computer programmer, an engineer would do because it's the simplest thing to do because you're doing measurement. And then you're going to go up 2 modal half steps or 1 modal whole step to get to the next note, up another 2 modal half steps or 1 modal whole step to get to the next note, and up a 2 modal half steps or 1 modal whole step to get to the next note. Note, either convention assumes that we're going to start with a baseline triad and all of the modal half steps before the one that we are on are included. So as we go up the scale degrees or go up modal whole steps, we assume that all other notes are included. Now, we could drop some of those other notes in theory, and later, if we have a cleaner system, it will be easier for us to list which of those other notes we want to drop, which is harder to do if your system isn't clean, because then the chord conventions get too complex. So we want the chords to be as clean as possible so that then I can do more complex things to them. Like say I want to play in a different octave. I have a spread chord, the third is an octave up or something like that. We'll talk more about that later. But if you have a clean chord consistent system that you understand as cleanly as possible, then you can do those things. Now, if we saw this by scale degrees, all these would be off by 1. We're going to say we start on the 1 now from the scale degree and then go up 2 modal whole steps, 2 modal whole steps, 2 modal whole steps. So normally people will call this a 1, 3, 5, 7. But what we would like to do is I happen to be on node number 1, but if I weren't on node number 1, as we'll do shortly on like the Mixolydian, I don't want to make it the 1, right? So I can easily convert this to a distance terminology by just saying all of those should be down by 1. I should be on the node we're on, and then the 2, 4, 6. And so we can call those the modal half steps, right? From a modal half steps point of view, it's the 2, 4, 6. From a scale degree standpoint, therefore, it's the 0, 2, 4, 6. From a scale degree standpoint, therefore, it's the 1, 3, 5, 7, right? 1, 3, 5, 7 includes the node that we're on, which from a programming standpoint is an error. So what are the modes that are in it? Well, if we start on mode number 1, because the Ionian is mode number 1, we would be holding down the Ionian, the Phrygian, the Mixolydian, and then we have to hold down the Locrian, right? So if you were to look at that on the guitar here, you'd have like the Locrian would need to be included on that one. So you have boom, boom, and then you'd have to be including, the Locrian on that one. So that shape is going to be different than like the Mixolydian, by the way. If you hold the Mixolydian, notice that this note is different. And we want to be able to identify that with our chord constructions as easy as possible in the context of the song, which you have 7 chords. We'll talk about that later. All right, what if it was a 5-note chord? What would it normally be called? It would be called a C major 9. So a C major 9. Now, where does the 9 come from? Well, they basically said, we're going to take every other note, we're going to make a scale, we're going to take every other note, but there's only 7 notes in the musical alphabet, and then instead of going around the horn, going back to 2, they want to go up to 9, even though there isn't a 9 in scale degrees. Why? Because we assume that you take every note, so we're assuming that you're going to take the 1, 3, 5, 7, and then the 9, and if we made it a 2, I think they were worried that the 2 is a smaller number than the 7, so that wouldn't indicate that you should be taking the 1, 3, 5, 7, and then the 2. So they made it a 9. That's kind of confusing. That's adding another layer of complexity that's not really necessary. What would be easier? You don't need to call it a 9. You could just say, hey, look, just take an Ionian C4, meaning you're going to start on the Ionian node, which happens to be a C, and go up 4 modal half steps. And we're smart enough to know that we're going to go around the horn back to the 2. We're just going to go around in a circle, right? So if I look at this, it's going to go, okay. If you think about this, you're just going to say, all right, that's going to be, from a scale degree standpoint, it would be the 1, and then the 3, and then the 5, and then the 7, and then the 9. This 9 is equivalent to the 2, right? The 9 is equivalent to the 2. So it would be easier to just say, hey, look, we're just going down around, get out of here. We're just going around the circle, and we're going to take modal half steps to just build a chord that's going to be that many notes long, right? I got distracted by the thing. So let me show you. Let's go back on over here. I'm trying to use the cool tools, and it's kind of confusing me, but I'm trying to be cool with the tool. All right. So it would be easier, instead of naming the scale degree, just say, hey, look, no, just take every other note. Just take every other note, right? And then you could make it a capital, and that would make it the modal center. So from a scale degree, from a proper distance terminology, we would say, how do you build it? You start on the node you're on, then you go up 2 modal half steps, 1 modal whole step, another 2 modal half steps, another 2 modal half steps, another 2 modal half steps. That would give us the 0, 2, 4, 6, 8. From a scale degree, then we would make it the 1, and then go up 2 modal half steps, 2 modal half steps, 2 modal half steps, 2 modal half steps. So from a scale degree, you get the 1, 3, 5, 7. There's only 7 scale degrees. They went up to 9 instead of going back down to 2. We're going to keep this as 8, right? Because 8 simply means that you're going up like an octave, right? You're just going to go, but you're going around the circle pitch-wise, and so it should be fine. So in other words, if I looked at it this way, what are the nodes? We're starting on node 1, which would be Ionian, and then we'd have node 3 and node 5, node 7, and then node 2, right? Because we're going around to node 2. And we can see that because we just imagine this going around in a circle. So we have the nodes that we would hold down: Ionian, Phrygian, Mixolydian, Locrian, Dorian. Now it's useful to see them in this order instead of putting the Dorian here, because technically the Dorian should be an octave up, right? It shouldn't be this Dorian if we're thinking about going around in a circle and distance-wise, linearly, like it's more of a spiral thing. This should be the Dorian that's an octave up. Now on the guitar, we grab whatever we can get, typically, right? So we kind of use the same name oftentimes, but we should technically have it in order, right? And showing distance as well as pitch. But let's go to, what if we make a 6-note chord? What would that be called? Well, it'd be called a C major 11. What does the 11 mean? Well, there's only 7 notes. Then they went up to the 9, and then they went up to the 11. So now the 9 is equivalent to the 2, the 11 is equivalent to the 4. But you're just skipping every other note. What would be easier? Just call it an Ionian C5 chord, meaning it's a 6-note Ionian C chord. Why? Because I'm on the node we're on, and then we're just going to skip every other note 5 times. So what would that look like if it was at 11? Let's think about it from a scale degree standpoint. It would be Ionian, it would be the 1, and then the 3, and then the 5, and then the 7, 9, and then the 11. The 11 here, the Lydian, is equivalent to the 4. So see, but it would be easier just to say, hey, look, just skip every other note, and then you don't have to list it as the 11 or not. You just realize that you're just going to keep going around in a circle, skipping every other note on the continents, which are in a block format, meaning it's a circle, right, in general. All right, so that would be easy, a much cleaner convention. And so we're going to say, all right, well then, and then what are the nodes? We would say, okay, so now we have the Ionian. We've got the 1, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, right? And then we can say, okay, let me get this out of here. I think I have some kind of issue happening. Why are there 2 of these? Oh, I can't take it. So that goes to the scale degree of a 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11. All right. And then the modes that are going to be in, the modes will be Ionian, Phrygian, Mixolydian, Locrian, Dorian, and Lydian. All right, let's do one more here. So we're going to say, all right, what if we add all of the notes in the key? What would we call that? A C major 13. Why? Because we're going to take all 1, 3, 5, 7, and then the 9 is equivalent to the 2, the 11 is equivalent to the 4, and the 13 is equivalent to the 6. So we assume we're basically grabbing the entire thing. Now, in practice, that doesn't happen on the guitar because it's impossible. We only have 5 strings and like 4 available fingers. But you can grab the 13, and then you'll have to drop some notes in between. Now, later on, if we use a cleaner system, we can list which notes we want to drop, possibly, right? It'd be a lot easier if we have the shortest system possible to start thinking, how can I add a little bit more detail to say, I want to grab that 13, but I want to drop the 5 or something like that, right? So it would be easier for us to do that if we have a shorter, simple system that's contextual to the song, and then we can introduce more complexity on top, which won't overwhelm us, hopefully. So we'll do that later. So if we have, this would be the 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, and then 13. The 13 is equivalent to the 6. See, all right? And so I'm going to try to go through this fairly quickly because we're running long on time. I want to go through the other 2 modes here. So let's see if I can do this. All right. So then here's the steps. It would be 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. Scale degrees would be all off by 1. The 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13. 9, 11, and 13 being equivalent to the 2, the 4, the 6. And then the modes are the Ionian, the Phrygian, the Mixolydian, Locrian, Dorian, Lydian, Aeolian. All right. So now let's go to the next one. So now we'll do one that's not the major key. The major key is a little bit more simple because it is what we use as the one with our numbering convention. But let's say we go to the Lydian. Why are we skipping the Dorian and the Phrygian? Because they are minor modes. Let's compare the modes that are most similar to the major key, which are the other major modes, which means they have a major third. We'll talk more about what a major third means in future presentations when we get to distance intervals. But from a general standpoint, it means if I'm going from this one to this one, this distance is actually 4 notes away. So we're skipping one modal whole step, but the C to the E is 1, 2, 3, 4 notes away. Again, we'll get into that later. I just want to intuitively note how easy it is to build the chords just from skipping every other note within the continents that we are on at this time. And once we talk about scale degrees, we'll get back here and then compare the scale degrees. Okay, so if we're on the Lydian, that would be the 4. We usually call that the 4 chord. So instead of the 1, I'm not going to change. What I want to do now is not change it to the 1. So if I go over here on the fretboard, I'm on the 4 chord. I can still build a bar chord, which has all the relative same positions, but it's not the same thing because the intervals are not the same. Or right now, let's just think of the shape is not the same. So all of the modes are not the same. The first 3 happen to have the same relative position, which is why we use the same name. All right. So I'm going to call it a Y for the Lydian. What would we normally call it? An F major. So why would we call it? And notice that the F major is the same as the C major. Now there's one benefit to that, and that is that the name is unique that way, right? If I say it's an F major, I'm starting on that F note and I'm stacking thirds on each other, and it's the same. It'll always be it's kind of like a unique chord. However, it doesn't give me as much contextual context within the song if I name two chords the major, because from the context of the song, it's not the same chord, right? It has a different feel within the context of the song. And my concern composing is the context of the song. So when I say I'm going from the 1 to the 4 is different than the 1, or the chord that's being built is different. And it might be that the 4 even is the tonal center. Even if that's the tonal center, I still want to call it the 4 because it'll tell me where I am on the guitar, right? And it'll also tell me what I can reach or how I can extend that chord to be in the same key if I'm playing in the key of Lydian, because it's a different chord. So it would be better in my opinion, and I think this is uncontroversial really from a playing standpoint, particularly on the guitar, is to name it by mode. Say, look, no, the 4 chord is different. I can call it from the Nashville music system the 4 chord. Even if it's the tonic, I'd still like to call it the 4 chord, right? Because it's the Lydian chord, and it has a different intervals in it. Not all the intervals are the same. It has an augmented fourth, right? So we'll talk about that later. So it'd be better to call it. Now, why do I call it a Y? Because we don't want to call it an L, because that kind of looks like a 1. So I put a Y for the Lydian. Why do we have it a 2 instead of a 3-note chord? We say by default it's going to be a triad, a 3-note triad, but this is a distance term. So we're going to start on the F Lydian, and then we're going to go up to modal whole steps, right? Up 2 modal whole steps from that point. That would be the idea. Now that gives us the context within the song. And so, like I say, if you're playing in Lydian, then it would be nice to say if that was the tonic, I can make that the capital even. And it would be nice to know that I'm playing in Lydian by having it identified in the chord name. Whereas if I use an F major, this F major doesn't tell me if it's the tonal center, and it doesn't tell me whether or not I'm playing in Lydian, the major key, Ionian or Mixolydian. I don't know. I don't really know. All three of them would have the same 3-note triad chord name. See, so this would be way more specific, even though it's the same 3 notes, because it'll tell you that the song has a chord tonal center of Lydian, and so that's really helpful. I feel like. So that means that we're going to start here on Lydian, and we'll do the same thing. That's going to be our center point. Now, the scale degree will force us to rename it, making that the 1, and this would be the 3 and the 5. But what I would rather say is, no, let's keep that as the node we're on, the 4, and say it's distance terms. It's 0, up 2 modal half steps, and up 2 modal half steps. So let's see what that would look like. We're going to say, okay, let's erase that and go, okay. So we would start on the Lydian now, and we'd say that's the node we're on. I'm not going to rename it. I'm just going to measure from there. So that's point 0 plus 2 modal half steps, which would be 1 modal whole step, plus 2 modal half steps, which would be 1 modal whole step. So we have a 0, 2, 4. What if I made this the 1 and made a scale out of it, right? Well, then everything would be off by 1. We would say now it's going to be the 1, 3, 5. So all of these are going to be increased by 1. So just remember that the scale degrees are all off by 1. If you want to know the distance terms so that you don't, like when you're building a chord off of this 4, and you're like, how am I going to build this? All I need to do to build the triad is skip every other note in order to build it that's of the 7 notes in the chord. But I don't want to rename that as the 1. I'm just going to drop it down. So if someone says it's the 1, 3, 5 scale degrees, that means it's the 0, 2, 4, right? It's 0, 2, 4 distance from this point. I don't need to rename the 4 to the 1 to do that. Do you see how much better that is? Because if you keep renaming this to the 1, you're doing more work. You don't need to rename it to the 1. What you want to do is say, I'm measuring distance from that point. To communicate with people, everything will be off by 1. They're going to say it's the 1, 3, 5, and you're just going to be like, okay, that just means it's the 0, 2, 4. And even if you use 1, 3, 5, just remember that those are basically distance terms. Don't let it force you out of visualizing the guitar in the way that's the most flexible. So that would be that if I start on the 4 and I name my nodes, now we're not starting on the 1, it's the 4. And then we go up 2 from there, giving us to 6, and then we go up 2 from there, 7, back to 1. So if I name the notes in the chord, that's not as effective as to name the nodes in the chord. How do I build this Lydian chord? How do I build a YF2? It's the Lydian, Aeolian, Ionian. What if I'm in a different key? Well, are we still doing the Lydian chord? Well, then it's the same. It's the Lydian, Ionian. It's the Lydian, Aeolian, Ionian. From a Nashville music, it's the 4, 6, 1 all the time. If I rename the scales, this doesn't work. This is really helpful. If I don't want to rename the name, because then I can't list the chord by the nodes that are in the chord, which is really useful. It will give you a lot more information about the song that you're building to call it something like an YF3. Why a YF3? Because we're going to say it's a 4-note chord, which is going to be a Lydian F chord with 3 modal whole steps from the node we're on. So it's the node we're on plus 3 modal whole steps. And if we want to make it the tonic, we can capitalize the Y. So that's going to give us a lot more information. See, because once again, it tells us, hey, look, if this is the tonic, I can see that that's going to be the center point of the song, and we're not playing then. That tells us, I don't have to say, hey, look, we're playing in the Lydian mode. We can just see from the chord that it's a Lydian chord. So you can't see it from the chord if you just call it a major chord. If you just called it a major, you'd have to say, hey, look, it's a major chord, but we're playing in Lydian, which a lot of people will get confused about. If you say, hey, look, we're playing from Lydian, and you memorize the fretboard in terms of where the Lydian point is, no matter what key you're playing in, you will start to be able to visualize the fretboard, all the 7 continents relative to that point. So it gives you a lot more information about the song, and you can easily convert it to say, well, the Lydian is the 4 chord. You could say the 4 is a major chord. So you can always talk to someone and say, well, we're on the 4 chord. We're on the Lydian chord. It's a major chord, right? Okay, and so then what are going to be the points? Well, it's going to be the Lydian has 0.0, and then we're going to go up 2 modal whole steps, or two modal half steps, or 1 modal whole step, and then another 2 and another 2. So we can call that then distance-wise, we're on the 0, 2, 4, 6 from the more scientific, modern way, the engineer's way of what we would call it. Well, but if we tie that into the scale degrees, it's all off by 1. So if I made the Lydian, the 4 node, the 1, and built a scale from it, we would say that we're on the scale degrees of the 1, 3, 5, 7. So remember, if someone says we're playing a 1, 3, 5, 7, you could just drop it down and say we're playing from the 4 node, the 0, 2, 4, 6. Those are actually the distances in a way that doesn't force you to rename the node that you're on. Why? Because I'd like to be able to say the chord name by nodes. I'm on the 4 node. And then I could just skip every other node. That gives me the 6 node. And then I skip every other node, 7 to 1, because there's only 7 nodes. And then I skip every other node, so 2 to 3. That means I know which nodes to hold down, specifically the Lydian, the Aeolian, the Ionian, the Phrygian. So, and that's movable. That's totally movable. So I know. So that tells me kind of where I am much more specifically than to say the notes on the guitar, which tells me specifically where I am, but it doesn't give you the context of the song. It doesn't tell you even if you're playing within the same diatonic key, which is useful. I mean, are we playing in the 7 notes, or did you do something wacky outside of the 7 notes? What if we had a 5-note chord? What would we normally call that? That would be an F major 9. Remember, there's only 7 scale degrees. They stopped at 7, they went up to 9. So now we have the 9 kind of like its equivalent pitch-wise to the 2, which becomes kind of an issue. And once again, this is the same name for the major and the Lydian. Doesn't give us any context about the song that we're playing. It would be easier as you play the song to say, hey, look, no, this is the 4 chord. This is, you can even call it, you can replace this with a 4 if you wanted to. You can call it a 4F4. It's a 4 chord F4, right? Or, but I think the letter is better because it'll make it easier to extend this. So I would call it, Lydian F4, which would be a 5-note Lydian chord from the F, right? And if it was the center point, you can call it an Y, and I called it an E. That should be an F. I won't fix it right now. I should fix it, but I'm going to say that's an F. Maybe I should fix it. Okay, I'm going to leave it. I'm running long on time. Let's skip every other note. If I go back on over here and we are on the Lydian, we'd say this would be the 1, the 3, the 5, the 7, and then the 9. The 9 is equivalent to the 2, right? From a scale degree standpoint. Okay, so erase that. It'd be easier just to say that we're going to skip every other note though. So we're going to go back on over. So remember that should be an F. Okay, so what would be included? It would be the Lydian, and then we're just saying it's the 0, 2, 4, 6, 8. Those are going to be the distances that we take every note from. The node we're on, plus 2 nodal half steps, plus another 2 nodal half steps, plus another 2 nodal half steps, plus another 2 nodal half steps. I don't have to worry about that being an 8 because I know that I can just count every other node as I go around the block. Once I get past the last node, I just go around the block. Whereas if it was a scale degree, I'd have to make this node the 1. I don't want to. It's the 4. It's the 4 node. But if I made it the 1, it would be the 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. The 9 is equivalent to the 2 because there is no 9 from a scale degree standpoint. So you got to know that that's kind of like the 2. But I'd rather keep this not as the 1, but as 0 or the node that we are on that we're measuring from because it's actually number 4. Absolute number 4, Nashville number system number 4. It's the Lydian node. And then if I go up 2, it would give me the Aeolian. If I go up another 2, I know that it goes around the horn. I don't have to worry about the 9 is equivalent to the 2. I'm just going to say, well, I go past 7. That brings me back to 1, the Ionian. And then 1 plus 2 gets me to the Phrygian, and plus 2 gets me to the Mixolydian. So this lists out the formula for the chord no matter what key we're in. So what if we added a 6-note chord? What would be the name? It would be an F major sharp 11. Now, why would that be? Well, this is where the Mixolydian is funny. We'll get to scale degrees later. I just want to note for now that this is not something that we should have to do if we're talking about something that is in the same diatonic key. This is one of the things. It's like, wait, and that you had to do that in order to make it work, and we're using the same 7 notes. You should only have to do something like that if you're going outside, if you're going in the ocean, you're pulling one of the notes from the ocean. That's when it should look funny. We shouldn't have to make it look funny if you're in the same diatonic key. But why does this happen? Because compared to the intervals up here, the 4 has a different distance. So we have to have an augmented or sharp 4. So we'll talk more about that later. Right now, I just want to note that that looks funny. And when it looks funny, you're going to say maybe it's not in the same diatonic key, but it is, right? But it'd be easier to say, look, if I just call it a YF5, which would be a 5-note F chord Lydian, then, I mean, it would be a 6-note chord on the F plus 5 modal whole steps. That tells you, look, this is still in the same diatonic key, because I know if I know this is the key that we're in, or that we have a Lydian in it, then this will give you an indication that no, this isn't something that's in the ocean. This isn't something that's pulling something in the ocean. It's in the 7 continents. It's still in the key. It gives us the context. And if it was the tonal center, I made it a P again. I need to fix that. I make that a Y. All right, I'm going to fix it this time. So now we have a YF5. So that gives us the tonal center. So then what would that be? It would be a distance of the node we're on, which would be 4, and then it goes up by another 2, 2, 6, 8, and then 10 from a distance standpoint. What about a scale degree standpoint? It would go from the 1, the 3, if I made the 4 node the 1 and count from it, starting at that point, which is not what you should do from just a normal engineering standpoint. 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, the 7, 9, and 11 are equivalent. I'm sorry, the 9 and the 11 are equivalent to the 2 and the 4. Let's keep on going because we're running long on time here. What I'd like to say is, from a mode standpoint, this shouldn't be the 1, it should be the 4. So we just skip every other node, 4 to 6, 6, 7, and then around the horn to 1, and then 1 to 3, and then 3 to 5, and then 5 to 7, meaning this chord we would hold down a 4, 6, 1, 3, 5, 7, or Lydian, Aeolian, Ionian, Phrygian, Mixolydian, Locrian. Now you can't actually do that, but that's kind of what we assume. We would drop some of those. On a piano you can kind of do that. That would be cool, but you can't really do that so much on a guitar, so you'd have to drop some of them, and we'll talk about how you can jot that down later. But for now, let's say we go up another one for a whole 7-note chord. So now we've got an F major 13. Now why is it a 13? Because we went up to 7 scale degrees, plus instead of going around to 2, we went to the 9, 11, and now the 13. But then we have to say that the 11 would have been included, because we assume it's included, but because it's a major 7, then we would think it has a major interval, but it doesn't, because it's different from the major, and compared to the major, it has a sharp 7. Now, that's not too messy. It's still kind of messy, though, and again, it kind of indicates, like with this, the fact that you have to do something funny feels like it's not in the same diatonic key, but it is in the same diatonic key, right? So it would be better, it would be nice to just use something clean to name it by mode. And that way, I know if there's something in the ocean, something that's outside the diatonic key, I'll be able to see it, because it'll be over here and say, hey, look, we're doing something funny, something outside the diatonic key typically, right? So I would rather call it, you know, it's a Lydian F6, meaning it's a 7-note Lydian F chord. It's the F plus 6 modal whole steps. And if it was the tonal center, we can call it this. I won't go back. Well, let me go back on over here one time and say, if it was the scale degree from the Lydian, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, the 13 equivalent to the 6, right? That would be the idea. Okay, erase. Is there a way to erase everything at the same time? I'm sure there is. I need to know the keystroke for erasing everything. That would be cool. If you really were a professor, you'd know how to do. Okay, Lydian. So the scale degree would be a 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, and 13, because it would all be off by 1. And then the modes that are involved would be all of the notes, but they're going to be in order of the 4, the 6, then 7, 1, 3, 5, 7, 2. All right, I want to try to do one more to get all the majors in place here. What did I do here? Get that out of here. What are you doing? All right. So the other major key is the 5, the Mixolydian. So this is like the bluesy one. So if I was on it, I want to keep that as the 5. I'm going to call it an X for Mixolydian, so it doesn't look like a major or minor, to keep it distinct. So we're going to call it, what would it normally call it if I had a 3-note Mixolydian? We would call it a G major, right? And that makes sense, kind of, because now the 3, the 1, 4, 5 are all major chords. That's what we learn. The 1, 4, 5 are major chords. And that chord is kind of unique because it's a G major. And so it would always be, it is kind of what it is from that standpoint, but it doesn't tell me the more important thing, contextually within the song, where does it lie, right? Am I playing in the key of the Ionian, and that happens to be, the 5 chord of the Ionian, which is a G major, or am I playing in Lydian, the F Lydian, and that happens to be within, or is that the tonic, and I'm playing in, I don't know. But it would be better if I just called it, hey, look, this is the Mixolydian G2, which would be a 3-note Mixolydian G chord. Why is that better? Because then if I was playing in the key of C, I know that this is the Mixolydian chord. It would be the 5 chord. You could call it that. I was debating calling it a 5G2 chord, because that would tell you from a Nashville number system. You could do that, but I don't think it's as good if you want to add more to your system after that. But you could do that. So it's the 5 chord. You would know that. And if it was the tonic, you could make this capital. That's another reason I kind of like this, because you can't do that with numbers. You can say, well, it's the capital here. So that means it's the tonic. That means by looking at this, I can't tell if I'm playing a major, a G major, right? Because I couldn't tell if that was a G major. I couldn't tell if it was a G Lydian, and I couldn't tell if it was a G Mixolydian. But if I see this, I can say, oh, that's going to be a Mixolydian, which I know the triad is equivalent in shape to a major triad, and I know where it is on the guitar, and I know that because it's Mixolydian, that what the overall shape looks like automatically, and I know what the tonal center is all at the same time with just that format. That's more important contextually, song-wise, than saying, well, the G major is when you write it this way, there's no other note that it could possibly be. Well, that's great, but it doesn't tell you what we want to know contextually within the song. Right? We're trying to make a song out of it, right? I want to know information about the context of the music. So the Mixolydian, we'd say, okay, what is it? You're going to start a distance of 0, 2, 4. So that would mean that if I was on the Mixolydian, we'd say we're here 1, 3, 5 from a scale degree, or 0, 2, 4, right? So that would mean Mixolydian, Locrian, Dorian would be the name of it. Between the 1 and the 3, or the 0 and the 4, there's going to be a 4-note actual distance, and that's why it's a major versus a minor mode. We'll get into the minor modes later, and we'll talk about intervals more later as well. But we just want to get the intuitive understanding of why this would be easier. So from a scale degree standpoint, we would call it, if we made the 5 the 1, then it would be a 1, 3, 5. But I don't want to make the 5 the 1. I'd rather keep the 5 the 5, because that allows me to name all the nodes in it, which is super cool, particularly on the guitar. I can say if I start on the 5, I go up by 2 to the 7, up by 2, 7, 8 is a 1, 1, and then the 2, 7, 1, 2. So that means I can name the Mixolydian triad by saying it's the 5, 7, 2. It's the Mixolydian, Locrian, Dorian node. And it is that no matter which of the 12 keys we're in, which is cool. All right, well, this is where it gets funny. So now let's say that we make a 4-note Mixolydian. What happened? Why isn't this called G major with a 7 of some kind? Because the Mixolydian doesn't line up to the major, so it didn't fit the convention, because the convention is wacky. So the blues guys and the jazz guys are like, hey, we need to come up with a convention for the 7 chords, which are basically the Mixolydian mode. They could have just called it, these are the Mixolydian intervals. I'm going to make this for the Mixolydian intervals. That would be the thing that makes sense, but it's not what we're doing anywhere else. So they just called it a G7. So that means, what does this mean now? Well, if you say that it's a major, then that means it's going to be a major versus a minor is going to be minor. And then the Mixolydian, we're still going to call major if it only has a triad, because the triad isn't different. It's the 7 that's different. As soon as you go up 1 from the triad, a 4-note chord, the 7 has a flat 7, and that's when the G7 comes in. So this new format, not saying it's major or minor, but just putting the number right after the letter, is what's going to be used all the way out once we get to the 7 plus in the Mixolydian mode. But again, it would be better just to call it a Mixolydian. Why don't we just call it, hey, this is an XG3, or you can use a Nashville number system, a 5G3, right? That would be easier because it tells you the context of the song. And you can also call it a capital XG3 because, once again, that'll tell you the context of the song. So this kind of tells you the context because it kind of says, if you see a G7, you're like, that sounds like a bluesy thing. That sounds like it's a Mixolydian kind of thing that's happening here. But it doesn't really tell you the context of the song. It would be nice if we just called it Mixolydian and said these are the intervals of the song. Okay, now it gets a little bit wonky. I won't get into the weeds on that, but so what would we name it? Mixolydian 0, 2, 4. So we start on the Mixolydian, go up 2, and then up another 2 and up another 2. Let's see what that would look like. If I'm on Mixolydian, we would go here. From a scale degree, that would be the 1. This would be the 3. This would be the 5. This would be the 7. From just a distance standpoint, that would be 0, 2, 4, 6. Okay, and then I'm going to delete this out, and then delete. Okay, and then all right. So that means it's going to be 0, 2, 4, 6. And then the Mixolydian from a scale degree would be a 1, 3, 5, 7. Because we would make the 0 or the 5 now the 1. And then it would be the 1, 3, 5, 7. That's a problem because I don't want to make the 5 the 1, because if I keep it as the 5, then I can name my chord by nodes. 5 plus 2 is 7, plus another 2 goes around the horn to 2, 7, 1, 2, and then to 4, and then to 4. So now I can name the chord by node, 5, 7, 2, 4, Mixolydian, Locrian, Dorian, Lydian. I can't do that with scale degrees. I'd have to learn a completely different numbering system for every scale degree every time I go to a different chord. Whereas if I do this, I could name the chords by location. That is so good that it's amazing how nice that is, particularly on the guitar. Maybe it's not as impressive on a piano. I get it, but I still think it's impressive on the piano, but on the guitar, that's certainly useful. All right, so then what if I add a 5-note chord? What would that normally be called? A G9. Well, the G9 doesn't look like a major chord. Isn't it a major chord? It is a major chord, but they couldn't fit the flat 7 in, so they just basically made up this whole thing, which still means it's a major triad, but it has a flat 7. That's what they did. That's what the number after the letter kind of means, which means they kind of made a Mixolydian naming convention. But it would be better to just name it outright and say, hey, look, this is a Mixolydian 5-note chord. You could call it a 5G4 for the 5-note Mixolydian, but I would call it an XG4, meaning it's the G plus 4 modal half steps from a distance, a 5-note chord. And if it was the tonic, I can make it a capital. This tells me the context of the song. So that would be a Mixolydian. It would start on 0, plus 2, plus 4, plus 6, plus 8. That's how you build it. You go plus 2, plus 2, plus 2, meaning a distance of 2, 4, 6, 8. If we look at it from a scale degree, we would make this the 1, the 5 would be made the 1, and then everything would be off by 1. 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. Why do we have a 9? Because the 9 is equivalent to the 2. So let's count it out. So now we've got this, we're going to say Mixolydian from a scale degree, 1, 3, 5, 9, and then 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, forgot how to count, and the Aeolian is equivalent to the 2. 9 is equivalent to the 2. from a distance standpoint, 0, 2, 4, 6, 8 distance. All right, delete. All right, okay, back on over. All right, so that means if I don't make that the 1 but keep it as the 5, then I can say it's 5 plus 2 is 7 plus 2 7 1 2 because there's only 7 nodes, plus 2 is 4 plus 2 is 6. So then it would be from a Nashville number system. I can name it. It's a 5 7 2 4 6. That's what you would hold down. Hold down the Mixolydian, Locrian, Dorian, Lydian, and Aeolian nodes, and you got it. What about if it was a 6-note chord? So now they're going to call it a G11. That doesn't look like a major chord. Well, it still has a major triad, but the 7 wasn't major, so now they put the 7 in there. So this basically means it's like the major, but it has a flat 7, which means it's basically the Mixolydian intervals. It would be easier if you just say it's the Mixolydian intervals. This is going to be an XG5 or a 5G5 if you want to use a Nashville number system, and then you can make it a capital XG5. So now we go up to 11. So it would be from Mixolydian, just from a scale degree, 1, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. The 11 is equivalent to the 4 from a distance standpoint, 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Okay, so let's delete this. And okay, let's go back on over. And we're gonna go, okay. So then, wait a sec, this is messed up. Okay. So now we've got, it's going to be the 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And then from a scale degree, if we make that the 1, it would be a 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11. The 9 and 11 equivalent to the 2 and the 4. But I don't want to make that the 1. I want to keep it as the 5 because then I can name all of the points that I have to hold down. It would be 5 plus 2 is 7 plus 2 around the horn to 2 plus 2 is 4 plus 2 is 6 plus 2 is 7 back to 1 again, back to 1. So it would be 5, 7, 2, 4, 6, 1 or Mixolydian, Locrian, Dorian, Lydian, Aeolian, Ionian. Hopefully I got that right. Is that right? 5, 6, 7, 7, 1, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, okay. So, all right. So let's go to the next one. What if it was a 7-note chord? So once again, it looks nice and clean, but it still doesn't fit the convention, right? Because you would think it would be a major chord because it has a major triad, but this basically means that it has a flat 7. So it has the major stuff with a flat 7, which means it's the Mixolydian. We'll get into the intervals later. But again, it would be better if you just named it Mixolydian. So a 5G6 or a XG6, 6 modal half steps from the node you're on, Mixolydian node, which in this case is a G. And if it was the modal center, I can make it capital. So this gives me a little bit more context, and it tells you exactly what is happening. Let's go back on over and count it out one more time. So for Mixolydian, from a scale degree, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 10, 11, 1, 3, 5, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. 13 is equivalent to the 6. Okay, let's go back on up. I'm an airplane now. I'm an airplane. Okay. So Mixolydian would be 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 now, distance-wise. Scale degree then, if we make that a 1, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, and 13. 9, 11, 13 equivalent to the evens, which are 2, 4, and 6 from a scale degree standpoint. But I don't want to make that the 1. I want to keep it as the 5. 5 plus 2 is 7, plus 2 around the horn gives us 2, plus 2 is 4, plus 2 is 6, plus 2 around the horn, 7 back to 1, plus 2 is 3. And that means that we would have a giant chord of a 5, 7, 2, 4, 6, 1, 3, which you couldn't hold down on the guitar, but you would drop some in the middle. And if we have a nice clean naming convention, we can then possibly add to it, giving us more detail of how to drop the stuff in the middle. This is clean looking, but again, I don't think it's as contextually clean as this, right? Because it's honest about, we're talking about modes here. This is subtly telling us it's a mode, They kind of snuck it in, those blues and jazz guys, because they didn't want to use modes for whatever reason. But let's just get explicit and say it's the mode, and then we can add possibly to it some things that we might drop, being more specific about it if it's useful to the context of the song that we're trying to get across.